I never thought I'd be the kind of man who second-guesses a gift. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a surveyor for the province of Ontario, driving out to sites in all weather, doing work that was honest and straightforward and left me too tired at the end of the day to dwell on anything. My wife Margaret passed 4 years ago, just after I retired. Ovarian cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to the end. I don't talk about that much, but you need to know it, because it matters to what happened later. It matters because, when she was gone, I was alone in a way I hadn't been since I was 22 years old, and I think my son-in-law saw that clearly, maybe more clearly than I did myself. My daughter is 38. She's a physiotherapist. She has her mother's stubbornness and her mother's laugh, and I thank God for both of those things every single day. Her husband, the one I'll get to, he came into the picture about 5 years ago. They married 2 years later. I didn't dislike him at first. He was charming in that particular way. Some men are charming, the kind that works better in a room full of people than it does one-on-one across a kitchen table. But I gave him the benefit of the doubt. My daughter loved him, and that was enough for me. The ring came on a Tuesday in March. My daughter had driven up from Mississauga to help me go through some of Margaret's things I'd been putting off. We had dinner, leftover soup from the night before, and afterwards she went through the bedroom closet, while I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me. Her husband hadn't come. He said he had a work thing. He called around 7 to check in, and before he hung up he said he had something for me. A gift. He said he'd been at an estate sale the weekend before and found something he thought I'd appreciate. He dropped by the following Saturday. He handed me a small velvet box, the kind you'd expect to hold cufflinks. Inside was a man's ring. Silver band, older looking, with a flat dark stone. Onyx, he said. He told me it had belonged to a surveyor, according to the estate records, and that it seemed right that I should have it. He said he'd had it cleaned and checked by a jeweler and that it was good quality. I put it on. It fit my right hand, the middle finger, almost perfectly. I should tell you that I am not a sentimental man about objects. I didn't wear jewelry for most of my working life. My wedding band I kept, but stopped wearing after Margaret died because I couldn't figure out what it meant anymore to have it on. So when I say the ring made me feel something, a kind of warmth, a connection to something I couldn't name, I want you to understand that was unusual for me. Unusual enough that I noticed it. I wore it home that Saturday. I wore it to bed that night, which I've never done with anything in my life. The first time I felt sick was about 3 weeks later. It started as tiredness. Deep tiredness, the kind that doesn't lift after a full night of sleep. I'd wake up, and my legs felt like they belonged to someone older than me, like there was something wrong in my blood. I chalked it up to winter, to grief, to being 67 and not 27. Then the nausea started. Not violent, not the kind that sends you to the bathroom, just a low, constant wrongness in my stomach that came and went with no pattern I could identify. I went to my GP in late April. She ran blood work, checked my thyroid, checked my liver, checked the usual things you check in a man my age who's losing weight and feeling tired. Everything came back within normal range. She suggested I might be depressed. She wasn't wrong that grief does this to people. She wasn't wrong that I'd been through a hard few years. She referred me to a therapist and told me to come back in 6 weeks. I didn't feel depressed. I felt poisoned. There's a difference, and I knew it in my body even when I couldn't name it. By June, I'd lost 11 pounds. My hands had started to shake, just slightly, in the mornings. There was a tingling in my fingertips that would come and go, mostly on my right hand. I noticed it, but the way you notice a sound in a house you've lived in long enough, you hear it, file it somewhere, keep moving. My daughter called every few days. She started coming up more often. She brought food, sat with me, watched me with the kind of careful eyes her mother had, the kind that see more than they let on. One evening in August, she asked me to hold out my hands. I did. She looked at them for a long time without saying anything. I asked her what she was looking at. She said my nails. I looked myself. They looked normal to me, or close enough to normal that I wouldn't have flagged it. But she's a physiotherapist. She's trained to notice the body in ways I'm not. She told me that the white horizontal lines across the base of my nails, Mies lines she called them, could indicate heavy metal toxicity. She said she'd seen something in a continuing education course, a case study. She said she wasn't diagnosing me. She said she wanted me to ask my doctor specifically to test for heavy metals. I told her she was worrying too much. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with her mother's eyes and said she'd drive me to the appointment herself. My GP ordered the test, partly because I asked, partly because I think she had been quietly uncertain about the depression explanation and was willing to try another angle. The results took about 10 days. When they came back, she called me herself instead of sending a portal message. She said my blood levels for arsenic were elevated. Not critically, not emergency room elevated, but enough. Enough to explain the symptoms. Enough to call it poisoning. She asked me the standard questions. Did I have old pipes? Did I live near any industrial sites? Did I eat a lot of certain types of fish? She ran through the checklist. I answered no to all of it. I drove home from that appointment, and I sat in my truck in the driveway for 40 minutes. Arsenic doesn't just appear. It comes from somewhere. It comes from something, or from someone. I want to tell you that the thought arrived like a thunderclap, fully formed and certain it didn't. It crept in the way cold does, slowly through the cracks, until you realize you've been freezing for a long time and just stopped noticing. I sat there in my truck, and I thought about the tiredness starting in late March. I thought about when it started. I thought about what changed in late March. I looked down at the ring. I'd been wearing it for 5 months. I took it off. My hand felt strange without it, lighter than it should have, like something had been removed that had been there long enough to seem like part of me. I held it between my thumb and forefinger in the gray August light coming through the windshield. The stone was dark. The band looked clean. Ordinary. I didn't know anything about metallurgy or about how poison could live in metal. I was a surveyor. I measured land. But I know that when two things happen at the same time, you don't call that a coincidence until you've ruled out everything else. I didn't call my son-in-law. Not yet. I called my daughter. She came up the next morning. I'd spent the night awake, mostly going through everything slowly, not panicking. Just laying it out the way I used to lay out survey data, fact by fact, keeping my hands steady. My daughter sat at the kitchen table and I told her all of it. The diagnosis, the elevated arsenic, the ring, the timeline. I watched her face while I talked. She's like her mother that way too. She keeps her face controlled when something is breaking through it. When I finished, she didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she picked up the ring from the table where I'd set it and held it the same way I had, carefully between 2 fingers, like something that might bite. She said she needed to make some calls. She has a colleague at the University Hospital in Toronto, someone she met during her clinical training, who works in occupational medicine. She called him that afternoon, described what we had, the symptoms, the blood results, the ring, the timeline. And he told her what to do. He told her to take the ring to a specific lab that does materials testing, not a jewelry, an actual analytical lab. He told her not to let me wear it again. He also told her to photograph it, all of it, before it left our hands. We drove to Toronto 2 days later. I sat in the waiting room of that lab while my daughter handled the paperwork. It felt unreal the way certain things feel when the facts are clear, but the meaning of the facts hasn't finished arriving yet. I was a 67-year-old retired surveyor from Barrie, sitting in a materials testing lab in Toronto, with a ring that might have been slowly killing me, and I still didn't want to believe that the person who gave it to me had meant for it to do that. The results took 4 days. I won't make you wait the way I had to. The ring had been treated. The inside of the band, the part that sat against my skin, against the thin skin of my finger that sits above the veins, had been coated with a compound. The lab report used technical language I had to have my daughter explain to me, but the plain version is this. There was a soluble arsenic compound on the interior surface of that ring, concentrated enough to absorb slowly through prolonged skin contact. The exterior and the stone were clean, Whatever had been done to it had been done carefully, precisely, to the part that touched me and not the part anyone else would see or touch. I sat with that report for a long time. The estate sale story. The surveyor's ring. The detail about having it cleaned and checked by a jeweler. All of it designed to make the ring feel meaningful to me, specifically to me, my profession, my history, my loneliness after Margaret, designed to make me want to wear it. Designed to make me keep wearing it. I need to explain something about my son-in-law and money, because otherwise none of this makes full sense. 2 years before Margaret died, she and I had updated our wills. In the event that my daughter predeceased me, or in the event of my death, the structure of the estate was such that a significant amount, the house, the pension survivor benefits, the RRSPs, would flow through my daughter and, by extension, to her household. To her marriage. My daughter earns well. But I'm not a poor man. I spent 31 years in a public sector job with a defined benefit pension. I was careful with money. Margaret was careful with money. What we built together was modest, but it was real. My son-in-law had been moving money around. My daughter had noticed it, had been noticing it for months before August, though she hadn't told me because she was still trying to make sense of it herself. Transfers she didn't recognize. A line of credit opened in his name alone against their shared equity. She'd confronted him twice. Both times he had explanations that were just plausible enough to be unsatisfying. She was watching him the way I'd been watching my own body, knowing something was wrong, not yet ready to name it. When she connected his financial behavior to the ring, something in her went very quiet and very certain. She's the one who insisted we call the police before we confronted him. I want to say that clearly, because I was the one who wanted to go to him directly. I was the one who wanted to look him in the eye and hear him explain himself, the way I'd have done in any dispute in my working life. Directly, in person, no intermediary. She said no. She said the moment he knew we knew, anything he hadn't already moved or hidden would disappear. She said we needed to do this right. She was right. She was completely right. I have the same stubbornness as her and the same need to handle things myself, and she inherited it from me, and she turned it into better judgment than I have. We went to the OPP, not the local detachment, the Financial Crimes and Major Fraud Unit, on her colleague's advice. We brought everything, the medical records, the lab report, the blood test results, the timeline, her own documentation of the financial transfers. We sat across from two officers for almost 3 hours. They didn't dismiss us. I want to say that because I'd wondered whether they might. Whether it would sound too indirect, too circumstantial, a ring and a timeline and a sick old man with an overactive imagination. They didn't dismiss any of it. They were methodical. They asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. One of them, a woman about my daughter's age, asked whether my son-in-law had any background in chemistry or pharmaceuticals. My daughter and I looked at each other. He had a degree in biochemistry. He'd never worked in the field. He'd gone into sales, pharmaceutical sales, but he had the education. He told us this when he and my daughter first started dating. He'd mentioned it casually, the way you mention something that feels irrelevant. I hadn't thought about it in years. The woman wrote it down and didn't react, just wrote it down and asked the next question. They arrested him 11 days later. They'd done their own investigation in that time. Things I wasn't privy to. Financial forensics I don't fully understand. What I know is that the case the Crown eventually laid included criminal negligence causing bodily harm, administration of a noxious substance, and fraud-related charges connected to the financial transfers. My daughter's name was on none of the fraud charges. She was a witness, a victim in some ways, though she bristles at that word. She left him. She did that before the arrest, once the police told her the timeline for moving forward. She left quietly, took what was hers, and moved into an apartment in Mississauga. She came up to Barrie the night she left, and we sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning. And she cried, and I didn't say anything useful. Just let her cry, the way I'd learned to do with her mother in the hard years. I've been asked several times, since all of this, how I feel about my son-in-law now. People want a clean answer. They want rage or they want forgiveness, one or the other. something they can hold on to. I don't have a clean answer. What I have is this. I understand that grief and loneliness can make a person visible to someone who wants to take advantage of them. I understand that I was lonely after Margaret, more than I admitted, and that I wanted to believe the ring meant something because it connected me to my work and to a version of myself that felt stable. He used that. He knew me well enough to use exactly that. What he did was deliberate and patient, and it was designed to kill me slowly enough that nobody would ask too many questions. I know that now. I knew it when I read the lab report, and I will live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. But I am still alive to live with it. That matters more than anything I feel about him. My doctor ran blood work again in October. The arsenic levels had dropped significantly, still elevated from baseline but trending in the right direction. She wants to see me every 3 months for the next year. I'm back to my normal weight, almost. The tremor in my hands is mostly gone. The nails, my daughter checks them every time she visits. And every time she holds my hand and looks carefully, and then nods and looks up at me and says they look good. I sold the house in November. Not because of what happened, or not entirely. It was too big for one person, and it had been too big since Margaret died. And I'd been waiting for a reason to move without knowing I was waiting. I bought a smaller place, a bungalow on a quiet street in Innisfil, close enough to the lake that I can walk there in 15 minutes. My daughter helped me move. Her new apartment is 40 minutes away and she calls every other day, sometimes every day, and when she calls she sounds more like herself than she has in years. I don't wear rings anymore. I don't think I will. There's a quote I've been thinking about since all of this. Something I heard a long time ago, though I can't remember where. Something about how the people who love you will always find a way to warn you, even when they're strangers. The jewelry, who sold my son-in-law the ring, had apparently grown suspicious after the transaction and reported something to a tip line. We learned this from the Crown attorney. I don't know what he noticed. I don't know what gave it away, but somewhere in that chain of events was a person who saw something wrong and said so, quietly, without fanfare. I think about that a lot. I think about how many points along the way a different outcome was possible, for better or for worse. I think about my daughter standing in my kitchen, holding my hands in hers, and looking at my nails and not saying anything until she was sure. I think about my GP picking up the phone instead of sending a portal message. I think about a stranger, a man I've never met, who sold a ring and then couldn't leave well enough alone. I was a surveyor for 31 years. My job was to stand in a field and take exact measurements and record what was actually there, not what was supposed to be there, not what someone had told me was there. You do that long enough, it becomes how you see everything. You learn to trust the instruments over the story. My body was the instrument. It told me the truth the whole time. I just needed someone to help me read it. I'm 67 years old. I'm still here. And I have learned, later than I should have, that the most dangerous place for poison to live is inside the thing you trust most. There's something I keep coming back to months after all of it. Not the ring, not the lab report, not even the morning my daughter sat across from me and held my hands in hers. What I keep coming back to is how long I already knew and how hard I worked not to. The body knows. I said that to my GP once, somewhere in the middle of all those appointments, and she nodded in the careful way doctors nod when they're not sure yet whether you're right or catastrophizing. But I was right. The tiredness, the tremor, the low wrongness that settled into my stomach in late March and never fully left. My body was telling me the truth from the beginning. What failed me wasn't my instincts. What failed me was that I didn't trust them enough to act on them sooner. That's not self-pity. That's just an honest accounting of what happened. I think about David a lot. Not with rage, not anymore, though I won't pretend rage wasn't part of it in the early months. What I think about is the patience of it, the planning, the care he took to make the ring feel meaningful to me specifically. My profession, my grief, my loneliness after Margaret, he didn't choose randomly. He chose exactly right, and he chose it because he had watched me closely enough to know what I needed to believe in. That takes a particular kind of intelligence, the kind completely untethered from any sense of what's right or wrong. Brilliance in service of nothing decent is just a sharper instrument for causing harm. I've thought about that more than I expected to. What saved me was the opposite. Claire's intelligence was the same kind of careful and observant, but it was pointed toward protecting something, not taking something. She noticed the lines on my nails when I had stopped noticing my own hands. She made the calls, asked the right people the right questions, and then, this is the part I'm most grateful for, she talked me out of handling it myself. I wanted to confront him directly. I wanted to do it my way, the way I've done everything in my life. Head on and alone. She was the one who said no. She was right, and she held that position even when I pushed back, which I did. That kind of steadiness, the willingness to do the harder thing correctly instead of the easier thing quickly, that's what I want to carry forward from all of this. I retired thinking the difficult parts of my life were mostly behind me. I thought the work of being a person, the real work, the work of figuring out who to trust and how to protect what matters, I thought that was something you finished before 60. I was wrong about that. The work doesn't stop. It just changes shape. I'm in Innisfield now. Smaller house, quieter street. Claire calls every other day. My nails look normal. My hands are steady in the mornings. I walk to the lake when the weather allows, which in Ontario means about 4 months of the year if you're not willing to wear serious boots. And I'm always willing to wear serious boots. I don't think I'll ever fully stop being the kind of man who wants to handle things himself, but I've learned at 67 that the people who love you honestly are not a burden on your independence. They are the instrument that reads true when everything else is giving you a story instead of a measurement. I was a surveyor. I know the difference.